When you think of slavery in ancient Rome, you probably picture absolute power, a brutal system where masters could do anything they wanted to their slaves. And for a long time, that was largely true. Slaves were considered property, or res mancipiu, things to be bought and sold just like a cow or a piece of land. The master's power, known as dominica potestas, was almost boundless. They controlled every aspect of a slave's life, where they lived, what they ate, who they married, and whether they lived or died. But was this power truly absolute? Were there any asterisk lines a master couldn't cross? The answer is yes, but it's complicated, and it changed dramatically over Rome's thousand-year history. Let us dive into the surprising and often overlooked laws and social customs that limited what an owner could do to a slave in ancient Rome. In the early days of the Roman Republic, the law was chillingly simple. A slave was property. The head of the household, the paterfamilias, had the power of life and death, vitae nessus potestas, not just over his slaves, but over his own children too. If a master killed his slave, it was like breaking his own pot. There was no murder charge, it was simply the destruction of one's own property. But even then, there were social pressures. A master known for extreme cruelty might earn a bad reputation, a mala fama, which could hurt his social standing and business dealings. Good Romans were expected to be firm but fair, not sadistic tyrants. So while the law didn't stop them, the fear of social judgment sometimes did. However, as Rome grew from a small city-state into a massive empire, things started to shift. The sheer number of slaves was staggering, sometimes making up a third of the population in some cities. Uprisings, like the famous one led by Spartacus, made the Romans realize that constant, unchecked brutality was not only cruel, it was dangerous. It created desperate people with nothing to lose. A slave who is treated with a basic level of decency and has a small hope for the future is less likely to rebel. This was a practical consideration, not necessarily a moral one. The first significant legal protection for slaves came surprisingly early. The Lex Petronia, passed around the year 19 AD, made it illegal for a master to send a slave to be killed by wild beasts in the arena without a magistrate's approval. Before this law, a master could just decide his slave was disobedient and sentence him to a gruesome public death for entertainment. Now, a judge had to agree that the slave had committed a crime worthy of such a fate. This was a huge step. For the first time, the state inserted itself between the master and his property, saying, "No, your power is not absolute." Then, under the Emperor Claudius in the mid-1st century AD, another important law was passed. It dealt with sick and elderly slaves. It was common practice for masters to abandon slaves who were too old or ill to work, often leaving them on the Tiber Island in Rome, which housed a temple to the god of healing, Aesculapius. They were just left there to die. Claudius decreed that any master who abandoned a sick slave in this way would lose ownership of that slave. And if the slave recovered, they were free. Furthermore, if a master chose to kill a sick slave instead of abandoning them, they could be charged with murder. This was revolutionary. It directly challenged the idea that a master had the right of life and death over his slave. The pace of reform picked up under the emperors Hadrian and Antoninus Pius in the 2nd century AD. These emperors were heavily influenced by Stoic philosophy, which emphasized reason, universal humanity, and self-control. Stoics argued that, while a person's status might be that of a slave, their soul was just as human as anyone else's. Hadrian took several steps. He banned masters from killing their slaves without a trial. If a master killed their slave, they faced the same penalty as if they'd killed someone else's slave. He also reinforced the Lex Petronia and expanded on it, making it harder for masters to sell slaves to a gladiator school or a brothel without a very good reason. This was a direct intervention in the master's right to profit from his slave in any way he chose. Imagine telling a business owner today that they can't sell their product to a certain customer because it is immoral. That's the level of intervention we're talking about. His successor, Antoninus Pius, went even further. He established a principle that if a master treated a slave with intolerable cruelty, the slave had the right to flee to a sacred place, like a temple or a statue of the emperor, and seek sanctuary. This wasn't just about physical abuse, it included things like forcing a slave into immoral acts or not providing them with enough food. When a slave did this, a magistrate would investigate. If the complaint was found to be true, the magistrate could force the master to sell the slave to a new owner, with the condition that the slave could never be sold back to the original cruel master. This was a groundbreaking concept. A slave now had a legal right to complain against their master and be protected by the state. The law essentially said that there was a minimum standard of treatment, and if a master fell below it, they would lose their property. Let's be clear, what was considered intolerable cruelty, the bar was pretty high. We're not talking about simple beatings, which were still considered a normal part of discipline. We're talking about excessive, sadistic cruelty that went beyond what was considered reasonable for correcting a slave. The jurist Gaius gives examples like torture or starvation. It was a protection against the worst of the worst, not a guarantee of a comfortable life. Another area where masters' power was limited was in the realm of contracts and business. Many slaves in urban settings, known as verni, were highly skilled. They were accountants, doctors, managers, and artisans. Masters often set these slaves up in businesses. To do this, they would give the slave a peculiar, a fund of money or property that the slave could manage as their own. Legally, the peculium still belonged to the master. A master could take it away at any time for any reason. However, in practice, this rarely happened. Why? Because it was bad for business. A slave who believed they could earn money, improve their peculium, and maybe one day buy their own freedom, was a highly motivated worker. If masters randomly confiscated their slave savings, the entire system of trust would collapse. Slaves would have no incentive to work hard or be honest. So, a powerful social and economic custom protected the slave's peculium, even if the letter of the law didn't. Some slaves amassed huge peculia, owning property, businesses, and even their own slaves. Finally, what about the ultimate limitation, manumission, the act of freeing a slave? A master could free a slave at any time. But could a master be forced to free a slave? Generally, no. However, there were some interesting exceptions. If a master made a promise in their will to free a slave that was legally binding, the heirs couldn't just ignore it. Also, if a slave managed to save up enough money in their peculium to buy their own freedom for a price agreed upon with the master, this often became a binding informal contract. If the master backed out, they would suffer a huge loss of reputation. So, while the image of the all-powerful Roman master holds some truth, especially in the early republic and in the brutal conditions of mines or large agricultural estates, it's not the full story. Over time, a complex web of laws, philosophical ideas, and practical economic needs placed real, though limited, checks on a master's power.